Hello, my name's Paul Lesage. Welcome to High Reliability and Crew Resource Management. What we want to do today is cover some of the later concepts that we've had with crew resource management and sort of see what's evolved over the last several years. So first of all, just a little bit on my background. I started out as a street medic working on an ambulance, and then for many years worked for a large fire department on the West Coast, also for a flight program. So as a flight paramedic and as a firefighter, I was always interested in crew resource management because of the teamwork. What I found, though, was somewhat disappointing in that most of the transitory stuff that allowed crew resource management to move into healthcare, in particular EMS, was pretty rigid and was actually sort of stuck back in the 70s and 80s when CRM first started, and it hadn't really evolved. So I've spent, since I retired from the fire department, the last 10 years working for a high reliability company and acting on a Go team. And with this particular team, we go out and we do human factors analysis. And we're going to show you some of the studies and some of the information we've found related to CRM. But I'm going to ask you to stay real curious during this whole session because I think that our curiosity is what helps us get through. There's no one way to do this. There's just a lot of different things that we've learned through human factors science and studies over the years that we should be paying attention to. So the first thing is really kind of what's a crew. This was originally called cockpit resource management way back in the late 1970s. And while it evolved from a U.S. military model, most of the documentation indicates that it really kind of traces its roots back to an accident where United Airlines ran out of fuel with a DC-8 airliner right over my hometown here in Portland, Oregon, and crashed. So with that particular event, more and more flight programs decided that they needed to start thinking about how to actually make crews interact better. Now, keep in mind at the time, a lot of the pilots in the 1960s and the 1970s were ex-military pilots, and it was a very hierarchical structure on the flight deck. And what they were trying to do is break down that hierarchy and make it more of a collaborative team. So what to do is they wanted to overcome what we call power gradients. And keep in mind, power gradients are often associated with a position, chief, assistant chief, lieutenant, that sort of thing. They're also associated with expertise. You can have someone with a lot more experience, but not the rank, and they can be exhibiting a power gradient. So in roughly 2015 through 2018, most of the human factors science folks like myself started to pivot toward team performance models and start looking at methods of effective communication. We knew the fundamentals. We wanted to know more about how we actually start applying those particular fundamentals. The first thing I can tell you about crew resource management is that I think the best way to think about it is a collection versus a collective of people. A collection of people is a group that is trying to do the same thing, but they really have no joint value or purpose, or they really aren't working together. Whereas a collective has the same goal, but they're actually working together to try to do it. And I like to use a bus stop scenario. If you've got 6, 7, 8 people waiting for a bus, and they're just all standing around doing their own thing and they get on the bus together, that's a collection. But if you've got 6 or 7 or 8 people waiting for the bus and they're actually actively, like one person's looking at the schedule and sharing it with others, and somebody else is doing a weather report to see whether or not it's going to be late, and someone else is talking about what stations it's going to go to, that's a collective. And so what we're really looking for is a team in the sense of that the team effectively works together. And we're going to be kind of harping on that concept as we go through today. So a key component is effective crew resource management, though, requires a leader. This isn't one of those things where everybody's in charge and decision-making gets crazy. The values and the goals of the team are common, but what we're going to find out is that risk perception is very different. And you really do have to have a leader on the team. That's a fundamental part. And you're also going to understand that even though you may disagree with the leader, you're going to have to, as a team, accept that sometimes the leader sees a different risk than you do. Your job in crew resource management is to make sure that your risk perception and risk intelligence, and we're going to describe both of those terms, is communicated to the team so the team can understand what it is that you personally are concerned about, and they may also share that concern, or they may be able to alleviate your concerns associated with it. One thing to keep in mind, though, is CRM is not team decision making. There's no vote. It's not like, okay, everybody who wants to take this particular hose line into the fire, put your hand up, or how many people think we should start an IV. There's always a clear decision maker, but the key is that decision maker has to be a really good listener and a leader and actually receive input, but make decisions. And so there's always going to be this part where people equivocate, because as we're going to see, 2020 hindsight comes into play, and we're going to show you that, because when things do go wrong, you can't just go, oh, well, we made the wrong decision, and so now we can't rely on those people anymore. It doesn't work that way. So effective teams are always looking to improve something called common ground. Common ground is really collective situational awareness. What are we all seeing? And we're going to talk about that and give you kind of a visual example of what common ground looks like. Now, keep in mind that just because you all see the same thing doesn't mean you identify that same thing as a risk. I like to use the concept that I grew up in the city, big urban environment, both in Boston as a child and then moved to Portland. There's 1 million people here. And so I was always very comfortable in the city. And I remember having a friend of mine from Montana, he visited, and we decided to go to a Blazer game. And, I parked downtown because it was cheaper than parking at the Coliseum. And, we're going to jump on a light rail train and take the light rail across the river, and it goes through a rather sketchy area of town. And I mean, by the time we got to the Coliseum, my friend was not having fun anymore. His everything was a threat. The way that person's walking, look at the way that guy's standing. Holy crap, dude, that guy's selling drugs on the corner. And to me, that's just background noise. And then I remember I visited him in Montana, and I met Billy the bull, and I was terrified, right? I was like, what am I supposed to do? He goes, well, you walk across this pasture. I'm like, there's all these large animals out here. And he says, well, they're cows. It's the bull you have to watch out for. And so my point here is that every single one of us has a different background. And when we want, the worst mistake we can make, the worst error we can make is when we walk into a situation and we think we have the same risk perception as the rest of the members on the team. Just because you're all sitting in a helicopter doesn't mean you have the same risk perception. Just because you and your partner both have 5 years of experience in an ambulance, you do not have the same risk perception. So stop thinking that every single time you see something that's a threat, that the other people see it as a threat as well, or vice versa. It just doesn't work that way. And we'll explain that here shortly. So common ground is really that area where you and your team have a shared perception and a shared understanding of the situation. Now, I like to mention, think about this when you go to a scene. Have you ever been to gone on a scene before? And I worked on a 4-person engine company and a heavy rescue company for a long time. And I remember walking out of scenes and going, oh yeah, did you see this? And somebody would be like, no, I didn't see that. Or did you see how many medications were on the counter? No, I didn't see those medications. And you'd always keep in mind that there's always one person that sees something differently than you. And so on the screen, the diagram is really to show that the leader is going to be the one who is the final decision maker, but the leader doesn't see everything on scene. So the leader may have something in common with team member 1 and 2, and a little bit with 3, and 3 might have some with 2, but none with 1. It's really variable. What you'll find out, though, in human factor science, studies have shown that when you actually quiz 4 or 5 members of a team, what they all saw in common, the common ground is actually very, very small. It'd be that black area in the middle of the diagram there. So what we're trying to do is expand common ground. We're trying to actually exercise our ability to see more. And one of the ways we used to practice in our fire service was we'd challenge each other when we came out of the scene to say, hey, did you see this? So we'd ask questions. It'd be like, so what color was the carpet in the living room? What channel was the TV on? Stuff like that. And that made you start being more aware, almost because there was a game out of it. But when you start asking these types of questions, even questions about the patient situation or his background or what the history was, it actually starts making people think more about being alert when they walk into a situation. And it's real easy for us to get complacent when we walk into scenes. So particularly something we've seen over and over again, or if it's a frequent flyer, that type of thing. So common ground, a good team is always trying to increase it, and a leader is always asking the team members for input so they can increase the entire team's situational awareness. Remember, common ground, collective situational awareness. It's really easy to set in well-ordered situations. So when things are going well, common ground is pretty easy to maintain. However, when things start getting a little bit chaotic or there's ambiguous stimuli coming in, you're not really sure what this means, it can get a little bit difficult to set common ground because people's risk parameters can differ. So you need to speak up. That helps you expand common ground. You needed to communicate anything that's unexpected or unusual in your view. Try and clarify ambiguities. Try not to use phrases that are open-ended or that other people could misinterpret. And we'll give you some examples of those later. One way to ensure understanding is to ask if they understood what your concern was. And you're not going to do this every time, but if you believe that it's rather chaotic and you give an order or ask somebody for a piece of information, you might repeat it or ask them, can you repeat back to me what it is? What is it that I need? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we call trading accuracy for speed. Every single high fidelity team, aviation, healthcare, critical care, air medical services, our firefighting, our ambulances, all that stuff, law enforcement, all have to act quickly sometimes. One of the downsides is sometimes we act quickly when we don't have to. There's a lot of studies out there that prove that this accuracy for speed thing is a really big deal. So when you can, we're going to show you slow down. Now, I show you this particular picture because one of the things we like to do during the educational process is show actual scene photos and see what it is you picked up. So one of the ways we train is we will show a picture and then take it off the screen briefly and say, what did you pick up? Now, in this particular picture, I was the flight medic, and we had one of our larger aircraft. So Barb's the flight nurse in the photo. We had one of our flight surgeons along with us. You can see another medic in the background taking information from one of the on-scene people. And this is a young child that the call came in that he fell out of the upstairs window when he pressed on a screen, and he flipped down onto the ground and had a very serious head injury. We were there to fly him to the trauma center. And because there was enough paramedics and a physician and a nurse around the patient, I do sometimes what I would do, which is just stand back and take some pictures. Well, what's interesting about this is the story was he fell here from the window and mom didn't move him. But one of the medics on scene noticed that mom has blood on her shoulder. And that led to a whole different series of questioning, which we found out that is not at all how the child got injured, is falling out of the window. And we'll just suffice it to say that there was a lot more action that was taken after this call by the law enforcement folks. But in this particular case, this is exactly what I'm talking about. We'll be so focused on one thing, we'll miss another cue. And it's actually the firefighter with a helmet there that has that look on his face like something doesn't seem right here, who's the one that spoke up as we were packaging the child to move him to the helicopter. So what we're looking for is this integrated approach. And the first step of high reliability and making sure that you work well as a team is to understand how we see risk. So the integrated approach here is the high reliability approach that was developed by SG Collaborative and Scott Griffith from American Airlines for the U.S. aviation industry back in the 1980s. And it's been really fundamental to high reliability, which is we have to all know how we see risk before we can start putting systems in place to manage it. And then once we have developed resilient systems, we have to discuss how the humans interact with that and then figure out what the organizational sustainment is. But today we're going to focus mainly on this see and understand risk portion because during crew resource management, this tends to be the critical part. We really need the team to have a collective view of how to approach a particular situation or a particular risk. So I'm going to give you two terms, first of all, that are critically important, and I want you to think about these in the context not just of work but home. Risk intelligence. Risk intelligence is your ability to determine the probability that something may or may not occur, and it's based on experience, not school. Careful situational awareness, understanding the system, that sort of thing. And I put "Are you a parent?" on there because I like to use the example that, think about risk intelligence. What's risky, what's not? I had two sons and still have two sons. And when my older son was, when he was first born, everything was a risk, right? Is that the right sound he's supposed to be making? I mean, I was super careful with everything around him. And I remember like when he would spit out his little binky on the ground, I'd boil it before I gave it back to him, because germs. And by the time the second one comes around, I mean, you're just taking the dog hair off it and sticking it back in their mouth because you're like, hey, it's good for your immune system. So think about it also if you've ever taught someone how to drive a car. The first couple times they drive a car, everything is a risk. Their risk intelligence is undeveloped. And then 2 weeks later, you're trying to get them to stop texting and driving. So risk intelligence is developed over time. Now, here's the most important part of risk intelligence. It helps you and I function every single day. But it's incredibly dangerous as well if we're not aware. And here's how. Risk intelligence tells you what's risky, and it's based on experience. If you do risky things over and over again and nothing bad happens, say drive 20 or 30 miles an hour over the limit, or you're blowing through stop signs in your ambulance and you've never been hit, your risk intelligence literally informs you that this is a safe activity. Now you can see how teamwork can be affected by people's different risk intelligence. You and I could have the same experience in the front of an ambulance or in a helicopter, or the same amount of years, I would say, but you've done different things, and therefore your interpretation of what's risky is different. And if we don't communicate that as part of the team becomes very dysfunctional. Now, the next term I want to introduce you to is risk tolerance. While risk intelligence tells you what is risky, risk tolerance is what you will tolerate before you will make a change. And the example I like to use is you can determine your own risk tolerance on driving by just going out onto any freeway and driving the middle lane at 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. And all the people who are stacking it behind you and swerving around you to your left or right and are upset, you have a higher risk tolerance than they do. They're much lower risk tolerance. Then there's the person at 10 miles an hour over in the fast lane, or in the middle lane, that you pull up behind and they're going the speed limit. And you're like, really, dude? Seriously? And so he has a lower risk tolerance. And these are those sorts of things that's like, you think about it. So organizational risk tolerance, if I'm doing a post-incident analysis, organizational risk tolerance is actually found in your policies and procedures and that sort of thing. If I want to know what the organization, how they see risk, I open up a policy manual. Not the humans that work in it, the organization itself. Now, this is simple. So I would say you're out on the highway. How do I know what the state's risk tolerance is for speed? Simple. Speed limit signs alongside the road. Now let's go back inside the organization. How do I know how the organization actually enforces that risk tolerance? Well, it turns out you can do the same thing on the freeway. A cop is unlikely to give you a ticket in a 65 mile an hour zone for, say, 67 or 68 miles an hour. It's not that you aren't breaking the law technically, it's that they don't see that as a risk. So a police officer, you have to hit their risk tolerance before you trigger their action. It's the same with a supervisor. Supervisors rarely enforce the rules right down to the nth degree. There's often some flexibility. Now, the next risk perception is the employee. That's different from the supervisor because they've seen fewer different risk types often than a supervisor has, and they're all over the map. So when you think about it on the highway, you can kind of translate that. Now that helps you as a team member when people state something's a risk or they're not worried about something. So if they are worried or they're not worried and it doesn't align with your beliefs, you've got to start being curious and not angry. You've got to stop being pissed off and you've got to go, wait a minute, why does this person see this completely differently than I do? And listen to what their interpretation of risk is around those parameters. I had a mentor of mine once that said, you can't be curious and angry at the same time. He said, I've never seen a curiously angry person. Well, I think that's good to know because a lot of times what we see in teamwork is people just clam up when a team member doesn't have the same risk perception they do. So this risk intelligence and risk tolerance, it's really important to keep in mind that situational awareness is both a prospective and retrospective attribute. So what I mean by that is, you have risk intelligence around a particular risk, and then when something goes wrong, it changes that particular risk intelligence. So you may be doing one thing for a long time and then recognize or get information or have a near miss, and you're like, oh my God, that's risky, and you'll change it. However, one of the things to recognize is these things are unshared characteristics. In other words, I don't usually talk to you when I change my risk intelligence or risk tolerance. We don't usually have those kinds of conversations. So because they're personal, we want to know, why won't Paul share his personal risk perceptions with the rest of the team? And what we're going to see here is that it makes me vulnerable. And no one likes to be vulnerable or made fun of or anything else. So we've got to be thinking about that. And I apologize if there's some noise in the background, but here I am recording this at home, and they've decided to do some sort of construction outside my office at the time I'm doing it. So this vulnerability that people are in, it helps you understand, if you're the team leader, that when people speak up, they're going to feel vulnerable. And you want to embrace that and actually kind of come out with that ahead of time and say, look, when we share information, we're making ourselves vulnerable. If I see anyone taking advantage of that potential vulnerability, we're going to have an offside conversation, because this is not what we want. What we want is good teams practice this collective process of risk intelligence, and it takes curiosity and it takes time. So it's really helpful for you as a leader to sort of institute and let people know that these are normal expectations in a team until the team is comfortable with themselves. The other thing about risk tolerance is, remember that your personal situational awareness is going to be based on what you perceive as a risk or an important stimulus. So if you don't perceive it and something bad happens, people are going to say, well, he wasn't situationally aware. And I've heard this 100 times. I've even heard it applied to myself. You had a lack of situational awareness. And it's like, well, I didn't actually perceive this as a risk, and therefore I didn't realize I was supposed to be aware of this situation. And so keep in mind, this is where I said it's prospective and retrospective. So it's often not that you don't see the risk or see the problem. You don't perceive it as something that requires action. So you and I can see the same exact thing when we're on a team, and you may think it needs action and I may not. And I say my tolerance versus my wife's. The signs on the left I took at a great hiking trail I used to go on. My wife's Hawaiian, and her family's from the Big Island. And I used to go on this great hiking trail, years and years, just a lot of fun, down this canyon where this waterfall, it's relatively secluded. And one year I went there, and all these signs are there. No jumping or diving, beware of flash floods, there's hazardous cliffs. And my wife's like, well, it doesn't look like we can hike here anymore. And I was like, well, I think we can hike just fine. I've been doing it for years. And this all makes it look that much more exciting to me. So, you know, everyone's different in the way that they perceive risk and what they're going to do. And these are all things I was aware of ahead of time, and I really didn't need a sign to tell me. However, if I'd got caught in a flash flood, someone would say I broke the rule and I was situationally unaware. So we have to kind of think about, like, how do people perceive these risks? And this is what's being taught now, or not, I should say, isn't being taught and should be taught about crew resource management, is really effective teams spend a lot of time talking about these risk situations. What do you perceive as a risk? When will you speak up? So let's address that. But first, just kind of take a look at this example. Here's a firefighter after a fire's been put out, and he has no self-contained breathing apparatus on. And if I retired as the assistant chief of operations in our large department, but if I was even an officer, a battalion chief, and he probably is because he's got a white thing on his helmet, you know, it's like, dude, seriously? You don't understand that the smoke is what kills you? And so do you actually think he doesn't see the smoke, or does he not understand the risk? Now, my question to people would be, what risks do you think the team members see in speaking up? This is a chief officer. Do you think one of the firefighters down below is going to be going, hey, chief, you need to put your mask on. That's policy. And there's a risk in this smoke. This is a dude that's probably, 50 years old, and he's been sucking smoke for years. And that's got part of that macho. And I was a firefighter for years, so I saw a lot of this stuff. And it's like, seriously, dude? But no one's going to challenge him because he doesn't perceive a risk. Why? Hasn't broken out with cancer yet, and he's always been able to do it. And therefore, his risk tolerance is much higher than mine would be, because I learned a lot about smoke and what it does to people and saw friends get really sick from it. And I just think we got this great breathing stuff. We should probably wear it. And that's the concept you have to think about, is why isn't somebody saying something, and why doesn't this dude see the risk? And you and I look at pictures all the time that create that sort of anxiety when we're like, seriously, you really did that with your kid? And I think people would probably say that with mine if they saw me sometimes. Luckily, mine are both in their 20s now, and they survived their childhood. One of the other things we talked about earlier that we just want to mention is, keep in mind that the faster a team processes information, the less accurate they get. This is true for individuals, so it's true for teams. So what we're trying to do is ensure that teams are actually more accurate when they are collectively self-aware. So if they're a collective of people working together, they can go faster than an individual with more accuracy at that speed level than you would by yourself, because someone's watching out for you. There's a book out there called The Efficiency Thoroughness Trade-Off. There's other concepts that military and fire department use, like slow is smooth and smooth is fast. The concept really here is to think about that if your team is pressed into fast action, it has a higher likelihood of missing cues, and that cue recognition is the stuff we'll see after the scene. So teams that work together, you want to try, if you're the team leader, to slow the team down a little bit. Every one of us has probably been in that situation where we've been running a code 99 or a cardiac arrest or something before, and we've said, okay, everybody just take a step back. Let's take it down a notch. And you work and you function better when everybody does that collective, hey, let's just step back for a moment. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention was, in all my post-incident analyses, and I've done thousands now of crash analyses and medical errors and everything else, what I would tell you is there's two messages out there inside every organization that affect teams and individuals. And I call them the overt and covert messages. The overt message is, safety's the number one priority here. And you hear it everywhere. Safety's our number one. We used to have it on the webpage in our fire department, and it was really kind of stupid because we went inside burning buildings. So safety really kind of wasn't our number one priority. It was a priority, along with putting out fires and saving people and sticking needles in people and all that. So one of the things that we find is the covert message is, it's really about production. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. One of the crash cases I analyzed and investigated, like many programs, including our own flight program, ours was 4 to go because we had 4 people on the aircraft, 2 pilots, a nurse, and a paramedic, or a paramedic and a crew chief. And they had this 3 to go, 1 to say no, or 4 to go, 1 to say no, which sounds really cool. And what it really was is, everyone has to agree that it's a safe flight. So all 3 say go, and only one of you can speak up and say no. Well, that looks fantastic on paper, but I'm here to tell you, and you can argue this with me all you want, but I'm old enough now and I've seen enough crashes where I'm just tired of this as an overt message. And the covert message is, we question the one who says no. One of the cases I analyzed, which was really pretty tragic, was a flight medic who spoke up. They flew into instrument flight rule conditions, IFR conditions, and they're VFR aircraft and VFR rules. And he said, hey, we're IFR, we need to turn around. And the flight nurse said, hey, Joe, it's a 2-year-old, same age as your kid that we're going to. And he said, yeah, and I want to get home to see him. So they turned around and they landed and safely, and the kid had to come in, the child had to come in by ground, and I don't know what the results were. But what I do know is 2 weeks later, he comes into the flight office they're going to accept a flight, and the pilots are doing a weather briefing. And like most programs, the pilot doesn't know what the mission is, he just knows where it is. And they do that so they don't get, involved in the emotional side of it. But the pilot, this is a different pilot, sees the paramedic walks in. He's like, hey, let's let Joe, the weatherman, make the call on this. Now, I call this organizational story. The number one, and I get a little fired up about this, but the number one barrier to good crew resource management in any organization is the stories you guys tell each other after somebody makes an error in a decision-making process, or if it doesn't go your way and you decide to tell a story about it. I'm going to show you some data here that's going to show you that it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong as much as whether or not you speak up. Because guess what? You will be wrong when you speak up sometimes, and you will be right. And the leader will be wrong sometimes, and the leader will be right. There is no parallel universe where you as a team member or the leader are always going to make the right decision. So you can get over that. But the problem is that the bad story that's created around this keeps people from speaking up. Oh, the last time somebody spoke up, they kind of got taken out, and this is what happened to them. And while there was no overt behavior around it, there was a lot of kind of little covert snide remarks and treatment that the person got that made them think that I probably shouldn't have spoken up. And that's what we find when we start digging into these crashes, is all their paperwork's in order, all their policies are in order, all the right training is there. Oh yeah, do you guys do crew resource management? Oh yeah, we had someone come in 4 years ago and teach it. Then you don't do crew resource management. You're not doing annual certification. You're not doing annual update training. You're not practicing it during your high fidelity simulation stuff. If you're not doing that every single way and you don't have a program that actually integrates it, and I'll give you my email address at the end and show you some skill sets and some stuff you can do to do that, it's got to be a concerted effort to make it work. You can't just have, it's not one and done. Not in the commercial aviation industry. They have to be recertified every year. Everybody, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, flight directors, every year. So it's not something you just do and then you get it. You've got to practice it. And this is part of it. And part of it is understanding what is it that affects it inside of an organization. How do you actually integrate a successful one? Because you don't just walk into any organization and go, hey, new culture on Monday. It doesn't work that way. You've got to actually have a process to make sure that people understand how this is going to move forward. So, power of organizational story. It's how stories tell you how things really work inside of an organization. Now, I'm here to tell you that in my belief, in my years of practice, stories are more powerful than a policy or procedure. I can change a policy with a stroke of a pen and send out an email. I can't change a story. And I used to tell my crews that. I'd start hearing a story and I'm like, whoa, stop. And here's what I'd tell them. What's your intention in telling me this story? What do you mean by doing? I mean, what's the intention you have behind telling the story? And it used to shut people down. A lot of times they're like, well, I mean, I didn't really have an intention. Okay, well, let's just discuss it for a minute. What's the byproduct of the story? What effect does it have on the organization and the people you're telling the story about? Do you want the same story told about you? And people start thinking more then before they start sharing stuff that otherwise was just gossip. And now it's like, wait a minute, is that really going to be effective in our crew resource management program? So stories communicate better than any other form. And it's really what our elders taught us. I had a company officer when I first became a firefighter paramedic. I was working on a rescue truck there was just two of us. It was a light rescue, and we had a ladder company, an engine company, and a rescue company at my fire station. And the rescue was the busiest. We were running all the time. And this guy named Earl was on the ladder truck. And of course, at the time, I thought he was almost dead. Earl was like 50. He's younger than I am now. And Earl was never upset about anything. Earl was always calm. And Earl was a good leader. Earl stayed cool. He always got input and everything else. And I remember once I was going to my first major structure fire of a huge store on fire, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were coming from an EMS call to it. And so the ladder truck arrived first, and we were still probably 10, 12 blocks away. I could see a glow in the sky. It was a big fire. And Earl arrived, and we had this technical way of doing size ups. You were supposed to pull up and say, it's a 100 by 250 building, fire showing from the Alpha Delta corner, blah, blah. It's supposed to be technical. Well Earl pulled up and Earl said, engine 51's arrived, or truck 51's arrived, and there's enough fire for everyone. That was his size up. I turned to my partner. I was like, what kind of size up was that? He said, that was an awesome size up. That's what that was. And then a couple weeks later, I'm at a different fire, and we're pushing water through a window, and Earl comes up, and he's like, is that a big fire or a little fire, boys? And I said, I don't know, Earl. I'm kind of new at this. I think it's a big fire. He goes, that's what I thought. He looks down, he goes, is that the big hose or the little hose? I said, well, it's the little one. He goes, that's what I thought. I said, you want us to get a bigger one? He said, that'd be a good idea. And he wanders on. And about a month later, I was getting transferred, and I went into Earl and I said, Earl, you've shown me a lot as a leader, but how is it you never get like excited or upset? And Earl leaned back and he said, it's not my stuff on fire. And you don't get that stuff out of books. And now you can learn bad stuff from people too. I'm not going to tell them today, but I've got plenty of bad stories that I learned from people that taught me what I didn't want to do as a leader. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a concept called negative warnings. There's a class out there, there are courses called Team Steps. A lot of healthcare people do crew resource management and Team Steps. I don't have anything negative against Team Steps. It's generally a very robust program. However, most crew resource management or teamwork programs that are out there make one major flaw. And here's what it is. When you speak up, you're going to save the day. So every single time you speak up in a Team Steps course or in another crew, at least the ones I took, I may not be the one you teach, but every time you speak up, you're going to save the day. You're going to save the person from getting the wrong medication. You're going to save the ambulance from going through the stop sign. Every time you speak up, you save the day. Well, it turns out that's not how it works. So the first barrier of us not speaking up in a team is we don't want to look stupid. When I first was a flight medic, I was a flight medic for the city county of Honolulu, and I took this picture out of the helicopter when we were going to an accident scene. It's down there on the upper road, and I remember the pilot saying, the LZ is just right around the corner on the upper road, and I had all kinds of questions about how we were going to get onto that upper road with that cliff right there, but all I said was okay. And we had a really tough time doing it afterwards, and I had seen some really heavy winds around some trees, but he'd been focused on a different aspect. And so we had a really long conversation about how he wanted my input, even though I was the new guy, and I could give him a perspective that he didn't have. And those are the kinds of teachers I wanted when I was learning these kinds of things. So let's talk a little bit about what a negative warning is. So it turns out that my team for years did an exercise where we would listen to, my Go team would listen to perfectly good flight. Nothing went wrong on the flight, but we would audit the CVRs, the cockpit voice recorders, the voice recorder in the flight deck. And most of these record the last 30 to 45 minutes, some are an hour, but generally they're recording what's going on. And I've listened to plenty of ones with crashes. These is ones where they're perfectly good. Nothing went wrong. And when we start listening to the teamwork between the pilots, we start listening and hearing them. And what we hear is 7 queries or statements to every one capture. What does that mean? Here's what that means. I will speak up as a team member 7 times when there isn't a problem for every 1 time that my teammate agrees there's a problem. So I'll say, hey, what do you think about the smoke coming out from over there? Or do you think this is the appropriate medication to be giving in this situation? Because I might do this. And my partner would say, no, I'm fine with this, or that smoke's not a problem, or the altimeter's right where it's supposed to be. So I'm increasing, they see it as an opportunity to increase team risk intelligence. That's how aviation sees it. We call it Chicken Little. Oh, geez, I don't want to go out with Paul again because, everything's a risk. The dude, he just speaks up all the time. So what we expect is you only speak up when you're going to save the day. The problem with that is you don't know what risk that you see is going to be the one that saves the day. So you've got to accept this concept of negative warnings. So we decided to do a little research, and I don't know how many cases, it was over 100, we'll see here in one of the next slides. We decided to ask, after an accident happened, we decided to ask teams how they perceived things. So what we did was, these were just the EMS firefighting and air medical crash incidents where there were survivors. And the Human Factors Go team I worked with, we would separate surviving team members for one final question. So we interviewed them generally together, but then we'd always separate them and we'd have one final question. And that question was something along the lines of, did you have any idea that this was going to happen? Now, keeping in mind that there's a bias associated with this question, because now that it's happened, they of course had an idea about it. We categorized their responses into 3 different categories. And that was, A failure to recognize, failure to notify, and failure to correct. Now, all of you who are interested in crew resource management, this is Sentinel data. So these are teams. Now, failure to recognize means if I had a team of 5 people and I separated them, each person said generally the same thing, which was, I had no clue this was going to happen. That was a team failure to recognize a risk. Now, failure to notify meant at least one of the 5 team members, it could be 10, could be 4, could be 2, but at least one team member said they saw the risk, they saw something was incongruent, we weren't following a rule, whatever it was, but they didn't notify the leader. They remained silent. Now, failure to correct was someone of the 5 members, 1, 2, or more, saw a risk, spoke up to the leader, and the leader acknowledged the information, but decided to continue doing what they were doing. Now, I'm going to give you a moment because I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to honestly do this. So I want you to write down right now, what's the most dangerous for a team? Failure to recognize, failure to notify, or failure to correct? So which one of these do you think is the highest risk for a team? No team members see the risk. Someone sees it but doesn't speak up. Someone speaks up but the leader doesn't change tack. Okay, now that you've got it written down, hopefully, because no one's watching you, so hopefully you're doing it. Here's what the results were. So 127 cases. Failure to recognize, 14% of the time. That's not too bad. Failure to notify. This is 74% of the time someone saw the risk but didn't speak up. Failure to correct, 12% of the time. Now, I like to say, what does this say about our culture? But it turns out the highest risk is failure to notify. And it's not because it's the highest number. Let me walk you through why. First of all, as a team, you can't expect that every one of you has seen everything. So it's actually pretty common that you will be presented with a situation where no one on the team recognizes a risk. None of us in the human factors world think that's unusual at all. It's pretty normal. There's 3, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you. None of you recognize that this was going to happen. Okay, I could say you had poor situational awareness. That would be the way that the old school would write it up. I would write it down as not that you had poor situational awareness, that none of you saw and understood the risk, which meant you either weren't exposed to it or you were exposed to it but didn't perceive it as a risk. And now you probably do. Now let's talk about failure to correct next. This is also okay and expected. Why? Because you may not have the right answer. I might speak up and say, hey, I think we should do A because B worries me. So the reason B worries me is because of X, Y, and Z, boss. So I think we should actually do A. And the boss could say, I've done B many, many times, Paul. I really appreciate your feedback. And I see how you see the risk with that. But I think we're going to stick with A because I'm more comfortable with it. Now, if A goes correct, that was a negative warning. But what if A goes haywire? What if the leader was notified of the risk I saw? Well, here's where the story creation starts. Because if A is correct and I warned him and I said, I think A is wrong and we should do B, he could walk around going, I'm not listening to Paul again. He can't get it right. He thought he was all worried and scared. Or if A goes wrong, that allows me to walk around and go, I told him this was going to go up the creek. Neither one of those are good team behaviors. If you find those in your team, you've got an ineffective team. So what you need to understand is, did the leader listen to you? Did they understand what your concerns and your risk perception was? If the answer is yes, did you present an alternative? If the answer is yes, if the leader understood your risk perception, understood your alternative, and made a choice to stick with the conclusion anyway, that's why they're the leader. And you get to do that sometime. My boss, one time I didn't like what we were doing, right? And I'm like, I don't like this. I don't think we should do it. And he said, put it on your list. I said, what list? He said, the list of stuff you can do when you're the fire chief. That list. Okay, I'll start making that right now. The point here is you got to understand the way people are seeing this. So the number one risk to your team and mine is people seeing it and not speaking up, because here's what's happening. There's a story running in their head. They're telling themselves a story. I see a risk. But the next chapter in that story is, I'm not going to speak up because Paul is fill in the blank. And we don't want to be there. We just don't want to be there. Look at this example from SkyWest. This is an actual event, okay? So in 2018, a CRJ United was performing a flight from Chicago to Ottawa with 50 passengers and 3 crew, and it's descending when the flight attendant observes an odor in seat row 9, and she thinks the fumes are coming from an overhead bin. Now, she opens the bin and doesn't see anything, but the smell gets stronger. So she contacts the flight deck. She says, me and a few passengers smell this. They declare an emergency. They expedite the approach. They advise the flight attendant to be a normal landing. They all get prepared for an evacuation. The aircraft lands safely, and the fire rigs come. They don't see any fire, so it taxis over and parks. Now, the Canadian Transportation Safety Board reported that the emergency services found no trace of fire, heat, smoke, or odor. Maintenance tested APU, everything. They found nothing. Maintenance concluded that the smoke was a result of water condensation from the air conditioning vent. It wasn't really smoke, but it had an odor to it. Now, the plane was out of service for 42 hours. Now, what do you think happened to the flight attendant? Had it been a real fire, hero. But this is a negative warning. You know what happened? Nothing. Why? It's aviation. They expect negative warnings. What would have happened if you had an ambulance out of service for 2 days, or a helicopter out of service for 2 days because somebody was worried about something that turned out to be nothing? Is your organization robust enough to take on that and understand that that's part of the overall risk assessment, and how you become highly reliable is by listening to people? Because you're going to have to separate noise from signal sometimes. And it's difficult. It's a science and an art, and it's mixed. So you're not going to get 100% results. That's why never events and zero error never works, because there's no such thing as a never event. Okay, a little bit now here as we wrap up. One thing out there is called sense making. The reason I introduced this into team training is because sense making is not problem solving. Sense making is when one of the members of your team makes random statements trying to figure out whether there's a problem. And if you're the team leader, you need to explore that a little bit. So this would be like, let's say you're on scene and a team member says, wow, that's a lot of blood. Now, are they just making an editorial comment, or what are they really trying to tell you? They're trying to tell you they're concerned. Or does this always operate like this? This is sense making. So you as a leader recognizing sense making, and sometimes this can help if you go back and you do why I said you do annual training, because you record your high fidelity scenarios. You will see people sense making, and you'll be more attuned. Hit my microphone. You'll be more attuned and recognize it, which is an important function. So one of the key takeaway messages for the training today, and this you can tell your staff, saying nothing as a team member is saying yes. So there's one way to say yes, two ways to say yes, and one way to say no. The one way to say no is to say, no, I don't agree with this. I think we should do something else. The 2 ways to say yes is to say, yes, I agree with it, or to say nothing. So if you say nothing, I guarantee you, because I've done so many of these interviews, the leader is going to say, Paul agreed with me. Well, how do you know that? He didn't say no. And we have a culture where you're supposed to speak up if something's wrong. Meanwhile, your person's in the other room going, I knew this was going to go wrong. That's a sick culture. So you're going to have to be open to being criticized, being vulnerable, and all those things that make you a powerful team. But that means the leader has to set the tone. If the leader isn't setting the tone about being vulnerable, when the leader makes that error, remember when they said, we're going to do A, thanks for your feedback on B, and it goes wrong. If the leader doesn't step up at the end and say, I understand this went wrong. I want you to know that Paul gave me some really good feedback about an alternate. I saw that as more risky than my path forward. We went this direction. That's what we need, though, is we need that feedback, and we're all going to make these kinds of errors. That shows that person's vulnerability, but it also shows that it's okay to make these kinds of errors. And then the last thing really is coherence. Coherence is not that you don't hear me, but you don't understand what I said. So there's lots and lots of those. I'm just going to use one example that we had. It's really common for people to not hear something clearly. We got a call once we were supposed to go get a cat out of a tree. The 911 center's like, yeah, there's a cat in a tree. So we went over there and we finished dinner because it's a cat in a tree. So we were in the middle of dinner and we have a heavy rescue truck. So we went over there to do this and we arrived and the family was pretty upset. And we're like, okay, we're here. And they're like, I can't believe it took you guys 20 minutes to get here. He's been up there and we're like, he? And she's like, yeah, I told him my kid was in a tree. And we're like, oh, we thought a cat was in a tree. So the dispatcher, they mistook cat for kid. And here you wind up with, well, it's a coherence issue. And there's a lot of other issues. There's tons of examples. So what your job is to do is to find out what's the person's risk perception, what's their risk intelligence, what's their risk tolerance, are we doing well as a team, how do I perceive risk? Am I speaking coherently? Not that they can hear me, but do they understand what I'm saying? Those are some really important points on the communication side. So what I'm going to tell you to do is to think about embedding these kinds of concepts in the DNA of your organization. That takes effort. That means you're going to have to actually undertake an effort to have a CRM program that's functional, embedded in training, and is annualized when it comes to certification and work. I like to use this example because I get a kick out of going into a hospital and saying there's signs that say it's Patient Safety Week at Memorial. And you're like, so what about the other 51 weeks of the year? So I always thought it'd be funny if we just said, hey, it's Passenger Safety Week at Denver International. I mean, what would you think if you saw that sign at the airport? Would you be like, what about next week? Are we not safe? And this is kind of the way you think about it with crew resource management. Are you doing it just once and calling it done? Or keeping in mind you've got this employee turnover, you have new leaders every year, all this stuff changes. So is it actually an integrated part of your high reliability program moving forward, or is it just a course you took? And that's where the difference between the really functional organizations and the ones that are not doing it as well as they probably could or should. So some summary stuff. Explore beyond the standard crew resource management and team step stuff. NASA has done a tremendous amount of human factors research. There's a brilliant woman named Barb Burian at the Ames NASA Research Center in California. She's written a lot of articles. I can tag you into some of those, or you can Google them and look them up yourself. Think of how you might incorporate exercises that improve this common ground that we're talking about. Look very carefully inside yourself and inside your organization for signs of a bad story. Bad stories kill crew resource management. And then embrace the negative warnings. This is a method to increase team risk intelligence. So thanks for listening today. I hope this was informative for you. You learn more about where crew resource management is going in the future. There's a lot more to it, and a lot of these topics we talked about today we could dive quite a bit deeper on or give you better examples. But this hopefully gave you a sense of the direction. And if you want more information, please go ahead and feel free to contact me. My email address is there on the screen, paul@SGC Partners, that's all together, SGCPartners.com. And I'll be happy to try to connect with you and send you more information. So thank you very much.